Notice of motion number 1. Ms Webb to move that the Legislative Council notes the Australian Parliament Standing Committee on Social Policy and Legal Affairs report, You Win Some, You Lose More, online gambling and its impacts on those experiencing gambling harm, and calls upon the Tasmanian Government to participate in the development of national gambling harm reduction strategies.
The Honourable Member for Nelson.
Thank you, Mr President. I rise to speak on this motion that I've put forward in the hope that our chamber will show its ongoing commitment to addressing the harm caused in the Tasmanian community by gambling. And the motion does note the report released by the Australian Parliament Standing Committee on Social Policy and Legal Affairs called You Win Some, You Lose More, Online Gambling and its Impacts on Those Experiencing Gambling Harm. And it calls on the Tasmanian Government, I think, to do something which is a very straightforward and very positive thing for us all to support and encourage. And while this particular report and its recommendations relate to online gambling, I do see this as an opportunity to meld together at a state level our responsibilities to policy development for both land-based and online gambling. Regulation of online gambling has usually been confined to the federal jurisdiction, with states perhaps contributing comments or supporting ideology about the dangers and harms of online gambling. This has in the past, Mr President, been used to protect land-based gambling often, by inferring that land-based gambling is not as dangerous and is being outgunned, if you will, by the growth of online gambling. However, after the recent passing of the Gaming Control Amendment, Future Gaming Markets Bill here in 2021 and the subsequent ministerial direction for the introduction of a card-based system for poker machine use, Tasmanians were privy to a significant change of public policy in this state in the area of gambling. Indeed, for the first time in my many years of work and advocacy on gambling regulation, the risk of harm to all, and in fact to any, users of poker machines was recognised by the commitment to introduce this universal pre-commitment card for all poker machine use statewide by the end of 2024. Mr President, that will be a nation-leading development when we see it come to fruition. And I have no doubt there are powerful pokies industry interests who are continuing to work hard behind the scenes to exert their influence on political parties and political decision makers in an attempt to undermine the introduction of that card. So I hope both major parties will stick with their previously expressed commitment to its introduction and not betray the Tasmanian people for the purposes of political self-interest. However, Mr President, today's motion presents us with what I hope is a much less politically charged policy discussion in this area, one that should not cause any disquiet or, I think, concern. The motion refers to the report and recommendations of the Australian Parliament Standing Committee on Social Policy and Legal Affairs from an inquiry it held into online gambling and its impacts. This inquiry report received unanimous support from all members of the authoring committee, which was comprised of Federal Labor Party, Liberal Party, National Party and independent representatives. 161 submissions were received as part of that inquiry. And notably for our consideration here, there were no submissions from Tasmanians that presented arguments against improving consumer protections for online gambling, quite the opposite. In fact, submissions from both the Tasmanian Government and the Tasmanian Liquor and Gaming Commission identified the increased risks posed by online gambling and their desire to protect consumers in Tasmania. Both the Government submission and the Liquor and Gaming Commission submission pointed particularly to the negative role that advertising can have on normalising gambling to children. Our Liquor and Gaming Commission submission made clear statements about the pervasive and negative impact of gambling advertising, saying this, and I quote, "The Commission notes the increase in the number of complaints received from consumers regarding the pervasive nature of gambling advertising, particularly in digital forms such as broadcast and social media. These complaints also include targeted advertising and tailored messaging to individuals on their personal devices, and in some instances, this has targeted people who have excluded themselves from gambling. Most of these complaints relate to wagering operators not licensed in Tasmania, and the Commission has little ability to take action other than to refer the complaint to the relevant regulator for investigation. It is the Commission's view that current media restrictions for gambling advertising are no longer effective in protecting children and vulnerable people from exposure to gambling products, and that legislation has not kept pace with the digital evolution. So, Mr President, clearly our Tasmanian regulator in the gambling space is calling for the same things that this report ultimately put forward as recommendations, in particular stronger media restrictions. Many of the submissions to the inquiry were from individuals, in particular people who experience gambling harm or are worried about the impact of online gambling on family members. I noted one particular submission, number 148, was from a grandparent who described their 4-year-old grandchild mimicking gambling ads attracted to their so-called flash. The submitter calls for this, and I quote, "Restricting streaming services, which are now ubiquitous, to one gambling ad per ad break and stopping gambling ads in play and live crosses will go a long way to ameliorating the harm." Mr President, that grandparent explains that the barrage of gambling ads when travelling on public buses that play commercial radio seems relentless. Another submission, number 35 to that inquiry, pointed out the inadequacy of current advertising rules, and I quote from that submission. Quite recently, during the Seven Network's Australians Got Talent program, what I consider family viewing, several gambling ads were shown. Having contacted ACMA, I was informed that this program held a PG. If we are constantly reminded betting companies are aiming their product at responsible adults, why were they appearing during PG timings? And the submission continues, Mr President, with this, I quote, "The Seven Perth Kids Institute 24-hour telethon was recently shown here in WA. This is a yearly telethon, supported and financially bolstered by none other than Kerry Stokes. It is watched by children and their families and friends who have sleepovers and remain watching throughout the night. Its sole aim is to help raise funds by encouraging donations to support research into children's cancers, disabilities and diseases. The Perth Kids Institute discoveries and knowledge is shared throughout Australia and worldwide for the benefit of children. Once again, why did the Seven Network feel it appropriate to program gambling ads during the telethon?" End of quote. Another submission that I saw, number 156, described the harm that they had experienced for over a decade, gambling online. This submission points out that, and I quote, "The promotions, incentives, 100% match bonuses, free play, free chips are sent via all types of correspondence at an alarming level. Even when you unsubscribe or close your account or even contact the casino's management advising them that you are a compulsive gambler and you need your account shut down permanently. They continue to send emails, letters via post, text messages as well as phone calls." Mr President, the common theme across the submissions is the inappropriateness of advertising and promotions by the gambling industry. So I'll move on to discussing the specific recommendations that I've mentioned in my motion that came from that report. It's recommendation 26 of the report, which calls on the Australian Government, with the cooperation of the states and territories, to implement a comprehensive ban on all forms of advertising for online gambling, to be introduced in 4 phases over 3 years, commencing immediately. I believe this recommendation would in particular provide better protection for Tasmania's young people. Commercial radio and TV and free-to-air sports broadcasts, as well as online platforms, currently have minimal restrictions on gambling advertising. Children watching sport with their families may think betting on who kicks the first goal is part of the game, in fact. It's not, Mr President. It's a gambling industry gimmick. Young people talking about the footy might currently think that gambling on the game in one of the many Bet With Friends apps is, to quote an APP reviewer, awesome. This so-called social betting is heavily advertised by the industry as the future of betting. We must now step in to stop these dangerous trends, which are actively working to normalise gambling in children and young people and build a harmful habit, which we know can have catastrophic impacts on people throughout their lives. Mr President, the report makes it a very reasonable call for a phased-in process over 3 years to give effect to this recommendation for a comprehensive ban on advertising. It is proposed to start with prohibiting inducements and advertising of online gambling on social media and removing the exemption for advertising during news and current affairs broadcasts. It would then slowly extend the hours of prohibition of advertising on commercial radio, starting with no ads being allowed during school drop-off and pick-up times. The implementation would include a phased-in prohibition of advertising in stadia and on players' uniforms. I agree with the assessment of the inquiry that taking the approach of 4 phases over 3 years is generous to the gambling industry. The important thing now is to not delay setting the starting date for this positive action. So, Mr President, my motion also calls on our chamber to support the report's additional call, which was for this: the Australian Government with the states and territories to develop a comprehensive national strategy on online gambling harm reduction. It specifies that the national strategy should be based on public health principles and be in place within 12 months, again allowing for progressive implementation. This is something I believe our chamber can easily support, Mr President, a national strategy to deliver on the goals and intent of the unanimously supported report of a federal parliamentary committee, a report that is in keeping with both our government's and our regulators' views on online gambling. A national strategy would dovetail into the work that we're doing in Tasmania, both in relation to the National Consumer Protection Framework for online wagering and to the introduction of a universal poker machine card. I put this motion here today with the hope that our chamber will do everything it can to protect Tasmanians and especially protect children and young people in our communities from harmful online gambling. I ask members to support the motion's call on the Tasmanian Government to commit to participating in the development of the proposed national strategy on online gambling harm reduction and to cooperate with the development and implementation of the recommended phase-out of all forms of advertising for online gambling. I commend the motion to the chamber.